At 9:42 p.m., her phone stopped moving. Location data placed it near a rural stretch of road. Then there was nothing. No outgoing calls. No social media activity. No signal change. Just stillness. Investigators would later say the silence itself became evidence. Earlier that evening, she had been messaging normally. Her digital behavior showed no indication of distress. And yet within minutes, her device transitioned from active movement to complete inactivity. That abrupt shift would become the first fracture in what initially appeared to be an ordinary missing persons report. Laken Marie West was 24 years old when she disappeared in 2024 in the United States. At first, her absence did not arrive with sirens or flashing lights. There was no confirmed emergency call reporting violence. No immediate public sign of struggle. What drew attention was something subtler: interruption. Friends noticed she stopped responding to messages. Family described the silence as out of character. Not dramatic. Just wrong. When adults leave voluntarily, investigators often look for behavioral preparation, financial withdrawals, packed belongings, farewell communication, digital searches suggesting relocation. In this case, publicly reported details indicate no such preparation was immediately evident. Her phone, however, told a different story. In the hours before it went dark, activity appeared routine. Messages were exchanged. Movement patterns were consistent with normal travel. Cell towers logged expected transitions. Then, without gradual battery decline or erratic signal loss, the device stopped moving altogether. Phones do not choose stillness. They are made still. That distinction matters in forensic analysis. Digital footprint reconstruction became central. Investigators mapped GPS pings, cell tower connections, message timestamps, and device activity logs. Modern smartphones capture accelerometer data, background application refresh cycles, and pairing records with nearby devices. Even when a person is silent, their technology is often not. Somewhere inside that reconstruction, a deviation appeared. At first, it seemed minor, the kind of detail that does not demand immediate confrontation. But deviations in a timeline introduce friction. And friction generates investigative focus. As authorities conducted interviews with individuals connected to Laken, one name surfaced repeatedly in publicly reported documents: Ronald Chester Racky. He was later arrested in 2026 and charged with second-degree murder in connection with her disappearance. As of the latest public reporting, her body has not been recovered, and the case represents a developing no-body prosecution. In early interviews, his demeanor was described as cooperative, calm, measured, controlled. Control can be interpreted in different ways. In criminal psychology, composure under scrutiny is not inherently suspicious. Many innocent individuals remain calm during questioning. But sustained control requires consistency. And consistency is tested against data. He reportedly provided an account of his movements during the critical window surrounding the time Laken's phone stopped transmitting movement. On its own, the explanation appeared plausible. But digital systems do not rely on memory. They rely on timestamps. And timestamps do not adjust themselves to fit narrative gaps. When investigators overlaid his reported movements with Laken's final known device activity, the margins narrowed. Not dramatically. Not conclusively. But enough to warrant deeper review. Her phone's final movement data indicated travel followed by abrupt stillness. Analysts examined whether the device had been powered down, manually disabled, shielded, or destroyed. Each scenario implies human intervention. In modern true crime investigations, digital evidence often becomes the silent witness. Phones log proximity events. Vehicles record pairing data. Apps capture background location services even when not actively in use. A device can reveal whether it was stationary inside a structure, traveling inside a vehicle, or moved after a certain time. Public filings suggest digital analysis played a role in elevating suspicion. Not a confession. Not eyewitness testimony. Data. Data rarely panics. People do. Investigators revisited a specific window of time that aligned closely with the moment Laken's device stopped moving. During that same period, questions emerged about the exactness of Raki's stated whereabouts. Small discrepancies surfaced. A timestamp that required clarification. A location that needed technological confirmation. On their own, these details were not explosive. Placed within the full reconstructed timeline, however, they began to compress his alibi. When margins shrink, pressure builds. In no-body cases, prosecutors rely on circumstantial layering. Pattern interruption. Digital silence. Behavioral shifts. Forensic traces. Post-event inconsistencies. Each element alone may appear insufficient. Combined, they form structural argument. Early in the case, one particular detail was logged but not immediately emphasized publicly. A discrepancy small enough to overlook. Investigators did not rush to confront it. Instead, they continued collecting corroborating evidence. Premature confrontation allows stories to evolve. Waiting allows contradictions to harden. The overlooked detail involved timing. Specifically, the relationship between a reported location and a verified digital timestamp. If a person claims to be in one place at a certain time, but digital records narrow that window, even slightly, the story begins to strain. And strained stories require maintenance. Maintenance creates behavioral cracks. As the investigation progressed, analysts continued refining the timeline, minute by minute. Last confirmed communication. Last outgoing message. Last movement ping. Last known signal shift. The precision mattered. Because in cases without a recovered body, absence must be proven through presence, the presence of digital silence where activity should exist. Laken's digital life did not taper off. It stopped. That distinction would eventually anchor the prosecution's theory. And the small timestamp discrepancy, the one that seemed insignificant at first, would grow in importance as more forensic evidence aligned around it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. But it was precise. And precision has a way of dismantling narratives built on approximation. The question moving forward is not simply what happened during that silent window. It is whether the digital evidence, layered against behavioral consistency, is strong enough to hold inside a courtroom trial. Because in the absence of a body, the timeline becomes the witness. And timelines, unlike memory, do not forget. At 6:11 a.m. the next morning, her phone briefly reconnected to a network. Not long enough to send a message. Not long enough to place a call. Just long enough to register a signal handshake. Then it disappeared again. Investigators would later say that moment mattered more than the silence the night before. Because silence can be explained. Movement after silence is harder to justify. By the time the investigation into the disappearance of Laken Marie West intensified, authorities were no longer treating it as a routine missing adult report. The digital footprint was now central. Phones, vehicles, and background applications were mapped into a minute-by-minute reconstruction. The early theory was simple: determine whether her device had powered down naturally or been manually manipulated. Battery analytics showed no gradual decline consistent with a dead battery. Instead, the device appeared to have been deliberately disabled. That distinction shifted the case. When investigators overlaid her last known device location with traffic cameras, toll data, and vehicle movement records in the surrounding area, they began narrowing possible contact points. This is where forensic evidence becomes less about physical traces and more about behavioral geometry: who was where, and when. During that same window, attention returned to Ronald Chester Raki. His earlier statement about his movements seemed specific. Specificity can be reassuring. It can also be rehearsed. In criminal psychology, spontaneous memory tends to include imperfections. Overly structured timelines sometimes signal preparation. Investigators examined his digital footprint next. Cell tower pings. Device movement patterns. Vehicle proximity data. Potential surveillance captures. On its own, none of it was definitive. But when layered against Laken's final movement pattern, a narrowing overlap emerged. This is where the case subtly shifted. The 6:11 a.m. signal reconnection suggested the device had either been powered on briefly or moved into an area with network access after being offline. That meant someone handled it after the original shutdown. And whoever handled it likely believed it was permanently disabled. That assumption would later become critical. Authorities began reconstructing the hours between the initial silence and the brief morning signal. If the phone was moved, it was moved by a person, not randomly, not accidentally. Investigators then revisited earlier interviews. When questioned about his whereabouts during the early morning hours, Raki reportedly maintained his initial account. No deviation. No visible hesitation. But this is where interrogation analysis becomes subtle. Consistency is not always confirmation. Sometimes it is rigidity. Detectives often look for adaptive memory, the way details evolve slightly as someone naturally recalls events. When a narrative remains structurally identical despite new evidence being introduced, it can signal defensive control. Control requires maintenance. Maintenance under scrutiny creates strain. Meanwhile, forensic teams examined physical spaces connected to the timeline. Search efforts expanded. Property examinations were conducted. Public reporting indicated that evidence collected during these searches contributed to the decision to pursue charges. In no-body prosecutions, the threshold for arrest typically requires cumulative probability, not a single dramatic breakthrough. Layer by layer, probability increases. The digital evidence placed Raki within geographic proximity during a window investigators considered critical. His stated movements did not fully align with the precision of the digital timestamps. And then there was the issue of distance. If his account were accurate, certain travel times would have required either a shorter route than publicly mapped or a faster transit than typical traffic patterns would allow. Alone, that discrepancy might seem minor. Placed inside a tightening window, it mattered. This is the overlooked detail investigators had quietly preserved. The margin between reported time and recorded time was smaller than initially believed. Margins are everything in forensic reconstruction. As more data was processed, analysts began testing hypothetical scenarios. Could the phone have been accidentally dropped? Could signal interruption have been environmental? Could the morning reconnection have been automatic? Each possibility was stress-tested against physical evidence and digital behavior. None fully reconciled with the totality of data. And then came the behavioral pivot. When authorities reapproached Raki with refined timeline analysis, subtle changes reportedly appeared. Not in the structure of his account, but in tone. Investigators often note when a subject shifts from cooperative explanation to defensive clarification. Clarification introduces qualifiers. Qualifiers create wiggle room. Statements that were once absolute become conditional. That shift can indicate internal recalibration. Publicly available charging documents suggest that digital reconstruction, rather than confession, formed a significant portion of the probable cause for arrest in 2026. It is important to remember, a charge is not a conviction. Allegations remain allegations until proven in a courtroom trial. But arrests are not made on speculation alone. By this stage, the case had transitioned from disappearance to suspected homicide, even though Laken's body had not been publicly recovered. No-body cases rely heavily on pattern collapse. In this investigation, the pattern that collapsed was control over time. The 6:11 a.m. signal. The narrowed travel window. The proximity overlap. And the rigidity of a maintained narrative under increasing technological precision. What initially looked like composure now appeared calculated. And calculation, when cross-examined against forensic timestamps, can expose its own limitations. Because digital systems do not negotiate. They record. As prosecutors prepared to formalize charges, the question was no longer whether the timeline contained inconsistencies. It was whether those inconsistencies, when presented to a jury, would outweigh the absence of a body. The arrest of Ronald Chester Raki in 2026 marked a public turning point. But the real turning point had occurred much earlier, at 6:11 a.m., when a phone briefly came back to life. Someone thought the device was silent. They were wrong. Going forward, the focus shifts to the courtroom strategy, how prosecutors intend to argue a homicide without recovered remains, how the defense may challenge digital precision, and why the smallest timestamp discrepancy may become the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire case. Because once control over the timeline collapses, everything else follows. The arrest came quietly. No dramatic chase. No televised standoff. In 2026, authorities arrested Ronald Chester Rackey and charged him with second-degree murder in connection with the disappearance of Laken Marie West. By then, the investigation had been building for months. And it was no longer about where Laken was. It was about whether the digital record could prove she was no longer alive. The prosecution's theory, as outlined in charging documents and public reporting, did not hinge on a confession. It hinged on structure. No body homicide cases in the United States depend on proving two elements beyond reasonable doubt. First, that the victim is deceased. Second, that the defendant caused that death. Without recovered remains, prosecutors must rely on absence reinforced by forensic evidence. Laken's digital life had been active, consistent, and routine until it stopped. No financial movement after disappearance. No communication. No verified sightings. No digital activity suggesting voluntary relocation. That sustained silence would be introduced not as mystery, but as pattern interruption. The prosecution's argument centers on three pillars: digital timeline compression, geographic proximity, behavioral inconsistency. The timeline compression is the most technical. Investigators reconstructed Laken's final movements through GPS logs, cell tower triangulation, and background app data. The final recorded movement was followed by abrupt stillness. Then came the 6:11 a.m. signal reconnection. That brief return to network contact suggested post-silence handling. In court, this detail would likely be framed as conscious manipulation. Someone powered the device on or moved it into signal range after believing it had been neutralized. That becomes powerful in a courtroom trial because it implies intent. But the prosecution's case does not rest on the phone alone. It rests on how Rackey's stated timeline intersected with that digital window. His reported whereabouts were initially broad. Later clarifications narrowed them. When digital mapping was applied, travel durations became critical. If he was where he claimed to be, the timing required precision. If he was not, the window for opportunity widened. This is where the overlooked detail from earlier episodes becomes central. The small timestamp discrepancy. Not hours. Minutes. In isolation, minutes seem insignificant. Placed against a phone's last known movement, they become everything. The defense, in contrast, is expected to focus on uncertainty. In a no-body prosecution, uncertainty is strategy. They may argue. Phones malfunction. GPS data is imperfect. Signal reconnection does not prove handling. Proximity is not proof of violence. They may emphasize the absence of direct physical evidence publicly tying Rackey to a confirmed act of homicide. They may question forensic assumptions. They may challenge the reliability of digital footprint interpretation. And they may highlight the fundamental legal principle: allegation is not guilt. This is where courtroom psychology enters. Jurors tend to seek narrative coherence. Digital cases must be presented in a way that feels sequential and logical. The prosecution's challenge will be to transform data into story without overstating conclusions. Too dramatic, and credibility weakens. Too technical, and engagement fades. The balance must be forensic, not emotional. Meanwhile, interrogation analysis may also surface. If video recordings of interviews are introduced, jurors will observe tone, posture, cadence, and responsiveness. Behavioral analysts often note that when a person maintains rigid consistency despite new information being introduced, it can signal defensive preservation rather than natural recall. But jurors are instructed carefully. Calmness is not guilt. Nervousness is not guilt. Behavior must be weighed alongside evidence. Another element likely to surface is search activity, if any existed, tied to digital devices. Modern prosecutions frequently examine browsing history, deleted files, and background app usage. If any such forensic evidence exists, its contextual interpretation will matter more than its existence. Intent is rarely proven by one action. It is inferred through accumulation. The arrest itself signaled that investigators believed the accumulation had crossed probable cause. But probable cause is not conviction. This is where the case truly shifts. Because once a charge is filed, control transfers from investigation to adversarial testing. Evidence is scrutinized. Methods are challenged. Assumptions are dissected. And the smallest overlooked detail can either strengthen or destabilize the entire structure. The timestamp discrepancy, the narrow margin between reported location and digital record, now becomes a fulcrum. If the prosecution demonstrates that this gap is incompatible with his account, it erodes credibility. If the defense demonstrates plausible explanation, it restores doubt. This is the tension unique to no-body cases. Absence must be persuasive. Silence must be structured. And jurors must decide whether digital precision outweighs physical absence. There is also the psychological component. Control appears repeatedly in the timeline. Control of narrative. Control of composure. Control of explanation. But digital systems resist control. They record passively. They log without bias. And when someone believes a device has been silenced permanently, a brief reactivation can become the one behavioral crack that collapses control. The 6:11 a.m. signal is not dramatic. It is technical. But technical evidence often carries disproportionate weight because it lacks emotional volatility. In this case, the courtroom trial will likely hinge on whether jurors interpret that brief digital reappearance as coincidence, or as proof of post-event handling. If they believe it indicates intentional manipulation, the structure holds. If they believe it introduces ambiguity, doubt expands. Laken's body has not been publicly recovered. That absence will remain present throughout the trial. The prosecution must persuade jurors that digital silence equals finality. The defense must persuade them that silence can also equal uncertainty. And hovering over everything is that narrow window of time. Minutes that seemed insignificant at first. Minutes investigators preserved quietly. Minutes that now sit at the center of a homicide charge. Going forward, the focus turns inward, toward the psychological autopsy. What patterns of control, isolation, or escalation may have preceded the disappearance? What behavioral themes appear consistently? And what warning signs, if any, emerge when we examine the timeline not just as data, but as human behavior under pressure? Because sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what was done. It is how carefully someone tried to prevent it from being seen. Before any verdict is reached, before any jury deliberates, there is another layer to examine. Not the digital layer. Not the forensic layer. The behavioral one. Because every timeline is more than timestamps. It is a record of human decisions. And when control begins to slip, behavior often reveals it before evidence does. In the disappearance of Laken Marie West, the prosecution's theory rests heavily on structure, digital silence, compressed timelines, geographic overlap, and the brief 6:11 a.m. signal reconnection. But beneath that structure lies a psychological pattern worth examining. This is not diagnosis. It is behavioral observation. Control appears repeatedly in the publicly reported details of this case. Control of narrative in early interviews. Control of tone. Control of specificity when describing movements. Control of consistency even as investigators refine the timeline. In criminal psychology, sustained control under scrutiny can serve two purposes. It can signal innocence, the steady composure of someone telling the truth. Or it can signal preservation, the careful maintenance of a constructed account. The distinction is not determined by demeanor alone. It is determined by how that demeanor interacts with evidence. The most revealing detail in this case is not loud. It is small. The timestamp discrepancy. The margin between reported location and verified digital movement. At first glance, minutes seem insignificant. But in behavioral analysis, people tend to remember events in broad strokes, not minute-level precision. When someone offers highly structured detail that later conflicts with technical data, it forces a question. Was the memory natural or curated? As investigators introduced refined digital analysis, the expectation would be adaptive recall. Minor corrections. Slight shifts. Clarifications that expand context. If instead the narrative remains rigid, unchanged in structure, that rigidity itself becomes behavioral data. Rigidity under pressure often reflects perceived threat. And perceived threat suggests something to protect. Another behavioral theme is escalation. While public reporting has not detailed a documented history of escalating conflict, no-body cases often involve moments of sudden rupture rather than prolonged visible deterioration. That rupture is frequently followed by rapid concealment behavior. The 6:11 a.m. signal reconnection sits inside that window. If the prosecution argues that the phone was intentionally powered or moved after being disabled, that action implies post-event awareness. Awareness implies recognition of consequence. Recognition of consequence implies consciousness of wrongdoing. Again, allegation is not conviction. But behavioral inference builds in layers. Why briefly reconnect a phone? Why risk network registration? Why not destroy it entirely? The answer may lie in assumption. Many individuals underestimate digital persistence. They believe powering down equals erasure. They believe short activation leaves no trace. That miscalculation could represent the psychological crack in this case. Not panic. Not confession. Overconfidence. Overconfidence often accompanies control-oriented personalities. A belief that the narrative is sufficient. A belief that technology can be managed. A belief that silence equals safety. But digital systems are indifferent. They log without emotion. If this case reaches full courtroom trial, the psychological autopsy will not revolve around dramatic motive. It will revolve around pattern. Did financial stress play a role? Was there relational strain? Was there perceived loss of control? Control-based offenses frequently involve moments where the offender believes authority over a situation is slipping, socially, financially, emotionally. When that perceived loss occurs, some individuals attempt to reassert dominance through decisive action. Again, this is general behavioral framework, not accusation. What makes this case analytically compelling is its restraint. There is no public confession. No dramatic body cam confrontation. No recovered remains presented to a jury. Instead, there is silence. And a timeline that refuses to bend. If prosecutors succeed, it will not be because of emotional appeal. It will be because they demonstrate that every plausible innocent explanation, cumulative forensic weight. If the defense succeeds, it will be because they widen the margin around those minutes. Because doubt lives inside margins. This is where the case ultimately rests. Not in spectacle. Not in sensational detail. But in whether jurors interpret a brief signal reconnection and a compressed travel window as coincidence, or as the unraveling of control. In American criminal courts, circumstantial evidence carries equal legal weight as direct evidence. But psychologically, jurors often crave physical confirmation. In a no-body prosecution, the absence itself must be reframed as evidence. Laken's digital life ended abruptly. No re-emergence. No financial trace. No verified independent movement. If jurors accept that this pattern is incompatible with voluntary disappearance, the first legal threshold is crossed. If they then accept that the timeline compression and digital proximity eliminate reasonable alternatives, the second threshold approaches. The verdict will not hinge on one dramatic moment. It will hinge on accumulation. And at the center of that accumulation sits a small oversight, a belief that a powered-down phone could not speak again. But it did. Briefly. Quietly. Precisely. If you were seated on that jury, would the digital footprint alone, without recovered remains, be enough to eliminate reasonable doubt? Or would the absence of physical confirmation outweigh the precision of technology? That question may ultimately define the outcome of this case, and the future of no-body prosecutions in modern true crime history. Before you go, let's test your instincts on this case. Answer in the comments below, no spoilers. What single moment do you think shifted the investigation from routine to critical? If you were on the jury, would a brief digital signal be enough to convince you something happened? Yes or no? Do you think the suspect's behavior under scrutiny signals careful truth-telling or deliberate control? Comment your answers, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more forensic deep dives into unsolved and high-profile true crime cases.